Hey, John.
Hi, Mickey.
Congratulations on writing this book. I am so incredibly jealous.
Well, that's a good sentiment to have right now. If I'm inspiring your jealousy, then I've accomplished something.
Yeah, it's a great book, and let me hold it up for the camera in the high-tech, slick, polished world of Blogging Heads TV. I'm talking with Jonathan Alter, my old colleague from Newsweek. He's written a book called The Defining Moment about FDR's 100 Days. It's exactly the sort of work of history I like, which is you've picked out the most telling anecdotes and amusing phrases and collected them. So you've weeded through the jungle for us and come back with the best stuff. It has short chapters. You can't put it down. Reads like a novel, as they always tell you to say,
love
but
it.
It does.
Thank you.
I mean, I was trying to go to bed last night, and I kept saying, well, I'll stop at the end of this chapter, and then I said, well, I'll read another chapter more. It's only 3 more pages. And it just pulls you along. It's a great story. It tells me all sorts of things I didn't know about FDR. So congratulations. I don't understand, how did you do it? Is it the old Newsweek thing where you don't have to work Wednesday and Thursday?
No. In fact, I didn't. One of the reasons why I didn't do a book that involved interviewing was because I didn't want to interfere with my day jobs, because I also do work for NBC. So I kind of did this late at night after my kids went to bed. But the secret for me was doing it over a 4-year period. So, a lot of times people, they feel like they've got to get the book out right away, and they crash it in a year or 2 years. And sometimes I go a couple months where I wouldn't do any work on it at all because I just get preoccupied, and then I'd go back to it. So in that sense, it was good. And it also was good when I was sick because it took my mind off my own problems, which is something that I never thought that a book would be able to do. But, because before I got sick, I didn't have problems that I needed to escape from. But anybody who has problems or is thinking too much about themselves, I recommend writing a book. It's a ball and chain, but it's a good ball and chain when you're thinking too much about yourself.
Maybe I just haven't been sick enough. It didn't work for me.
Yeah.
It just made me self-pitying and hard to be around. But
I was like that. I was like that some of the time on it, because I had moments when it's like a relationship, a book is, and there were times when I hated the book and I was grouchy, and then other times I was obsessed with the book and and loved it. So it's like any complex relationship.
Well, you may have a bit of Roosevelt's sunny disposition because, or in your, as you pointed out, slightly fake sunny disposition, because yours is sincere, but apparently you were a hero throughout. So
I don't know. Then I wouldn't go.
That's what I hear. Getting into the substance of the book, I mean, you portray Roosevelt as a little bit deceptive, theatrical, a bit of a con artist, manipulative, maybe all to a higher end. But am I correct in perceiving that that's sort of one of the original things about the book? And then I'm going to try to draw some analogies to current politicians.
Except for the maybe, I would agree. I don't think there's any maybe about for a higher end. I definitively believe that his various manipulations, while all of them were in his self-interest, were also in the interest of the country and the American people more broadly. So, he is kind of an ends justify the means kind of guy.
Well, there is this analogy you draw, which seems hokey, but it actually incredibly sort of fits on all fours, as they say, between his initiative at Warm Springs in helping polio victims, but not actually curing them, but reviving their spirits, and what he did with the Depression. As you point out, he actually didn't cure the Depression. Although he did better than you said. He cut the unemployment rate in half.
Well, except then it went way back up again.
Hopes up.
It went way back up again. So if he'd only served 2 terms as president, he would not have been seen as such a historic figure because, unemployment was still in double digits at the end of his second term.
So there is this sort of but there is this sort of snake oil quality in that he really he got the mind part but not the body part. I mean, he lifted people's hopes but didn't actually change that much.
No, it changed a lot. It totally changed the face of the country. I mean, basically the roads that anybody who's watching, drive on, many of them were built during the New Deal. I mean, one of the things I found that I didn't know, just this is a trivial example, but like I like to ski, and a paralyzed man created the American ski industry because the Civilian Conservation Corps cut the first ski trails in the United States, as well as planting 3 billion trees. So a lot changed, but unemployment did not, change as much as it could have, or as much as I thought it had when I started. And there wasn't as much of a business growth agenda as there might have been. So there were some problems with the New Deal. I would stop short of calling him a con man, although there is a little bit of that in him. But
I just meant that as there are a couple of very dramatic sort of moments in the book. Nobody really knew what the interior FDR was, but there are a couple of moments in the book. One where he's accidentally left in the White House alone in his wheelchair, incapable of getting around, a couple days after his inauguration, and he lets out this sort of piercing bellow, not at all sunny. And the other thing where somebody comes upon him sunning himself in Capabello after the first 100 days, and he's completely introspective and sort of and then all of a sudden he sees them and he puts on the fake.
It was a mask.
Sunny disposition.
It was a mask, a cheerful mask, and very few people got close to him. And I think below all of the ebullient spirit and the cheerfulness, which, as Winston Churchill said, was like opening a bottle of champagne, he could be cold. And he would cut people off if they didn't perform, unlike the incumbent.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
I guess I want to refine what I said. Obviously, Roosevelt did a lot of good. What I meant was you focus on the first 100 days.
Right.
And my standard view of Roosevelt, which may be a hack, conventional wisdom view, is the first 100 days were really a flop. I mean, the really big stuff came in the second 100 days: Social Security, unemployment insurance, old age assistance, what came to be the welfare system, all came in the second 100 days. The first 100 days he flirted with fascism and created the NRA, and it was less of a lasting achievement.
Well, I don't agree with that at all, actually. It's true that his greatest accomplishment domestically was Social Security, and I actually add a chapter as a kind of a coda on that because he considered it his greatest domestic achievement. Welfare kind of grew out of that at the same time, but it was pretty small at that time, and even Social Security only covered half the elderly, and the other dimensions of the second 100 days I think were less important than what was started in the first 100 days, because if you accept the fact that all of these ideas, most of them were just the seeds of larger ideas, then big things happened in the first 100 days. The first financial transparency, the Securities Act of 1933. It wasn't until 1934 that they launched the Securities and Exchange Commission, but they established the idea of oversight of Wall Street in the 100 days. The CCC, Roosevelt's Tree Army, which I mentioned, that established the idea of jobs programs that were then later expanded to the WPA and other agencies, other public works. I agree with you that the NRA was a bad idea in a lot of ways. They regulated the economy to a fare-thee well, to the point of literally regulating the burlesque industry to the point where they regulated how many times a stripper could take off her clothes each night from Washington. But in Clause 7A, it was the first time that collective bargaining was allowed. So it was they called it the Magna Carta of the American labor movement in the first 100 days. And then you also had Glass-Steagall, you had the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which left us with a farm program that we have to this day, the first time they paid price support. So, and which has some problems now, but basically has made us the most productive agricultural economy in the history of the world.
Right.
So the idea that the first 100 days was a flop, I just reject. Sorry.
I stand corrected. I'm one of the things I'm allowed to change my mind halfway through the show. So, but let's draw some parallels to Bush, because I was very interested, and you obviously wrote the book not unmindful of the parallels to Bush.
Yeah.
Peggy Noonan wrote a pretty good column last week or the week before where she pointed out that Bush's obsession with loyalty, which I had always thought was sort of a functional thing, is dysfunctional, because it really sort of he tends to cast out people who were disloyal, who might someday be of use to him or have good ideas.
Right.
I take it FDR's relation with loyalty was more complex and perhaps better?
Much better. To simplify it, maybe oversimplify it, Bush puts loyalty ahead of performance. FDR put performance ahead of loyalty. Now, obviously, he liked loyalty too, and Bush likes performance too. But it's a question of what are your priorities. And, it's a pretty simple axiom for being an effective president. If you don't put performance first, you're not going to be a competent president.
Is that because FDR had those years as an assistant secretary where he ran around Washington sniping at his boss, so he understood what it was like to be a disloyal subordinate yet serve the larger goal?
That's a great point. He was a disloyal subordinate, but he also learned how in Washington during World War I at the Navy Department how to use the levers of government to get things done. And he understood government. And people like to malign government. I don't think Bush either understands government or cares that much about government, about the mechanics of getting things done, the gearing of government. And if you want to be effective and competent, you have to, it doesn't mean you have to be a total detail man. Sometimes Roosevelt was like Reagan, he just wanted it all on one page, and he would be quite detached from the details. But then in other cases, he'd be very involved, and he understood how to knock heads together and get things done.
That's one of the stark contrasts in the book is there are these incredible feats of government organization and efficiency. The most obvious being the CCC getting, 250,000 people into remote areas working in a matter of 2 or 3 or 4 months.
Right.
There was an even more impressive one later when Harry Hopkins, working out of a card table in the hallway of some government building, got 3 million people to work in the precursor to the WPA.
Yeah, by that time they were up and running, though. So even though, and eventually 3 million people did work in the CCC as well. But by the time Hopkins did that, which was also impressive, they had their ducks lined up a little bit better. So the CCC, which at that time was the fastest and largest mobilization in American history, was incredible.
But what is the difference between then and now where Katrina sort of seems to have shaken people's faith in the government's ability to do anything? I assume it's because they were party machines and basically you had to call up 5 people on the Eastern Seaboard and they then whipped the machine into shape and produced the bodies for you. Am I wrong about that?
Well, you're certainly wrong as far as the CCC goes. The machines didn't have very much to do with that at all. And there were some problems in the CCC. For instance, they had some contracting problems with the toilet kits that the guys would have at the work camps. And there were big congressional hearings that embarrassed Louis Howe, who was the guy Roosevelt had running a lot of it. But, unlike this administration, they actually welcomed on some level accountability. Because what accountability would do for them is it would let them fix problems quickly. And this is where Eleanor was very, very important, not on the CCC in particular, although she helped there a lot with taming the bonus army and getting a number of them to enlist in the CCC. But she would go out and she'd travel all over the place, and she was a great journalist. And she and her very close friend, maybe not her lover,
At one point in the book, you do use the term the homosexually surrounding Eleanor.
Well,
Homosexuality surrounding.
those are other people who. Well, Lorena was definitely a homosexual, and a number of Eleanor's other close friends were homosexuals. So that there's no doubt about that. But anyway, it's not important. What's important is that Lorena Hickok, this very talented newspaper woman, convinced Eleanor when she was deeply depressed at the idea of being First Lady. On election night, she went into a serious depression, which she admitted, and she did not want to pass cookies and serve tea. And Lorena Hickok helped her realize that she could help her husband. She wrote a newspaper column, she held press conferences for the first time, and she became the Eleanor Roosevelt we all know. But the most important thing that she did is she gave him back channel to what was actually going on in the country. She filed these reports and put them in her husband's inbox next to his bed and say, I was out in St. Louis and XYZ program out there is not working, and then they'd fix it.
But that has to have helped, but that can't. The cycle of feedback involving congressional hearings and the press can't have been fast enough to get 250 million people employed in a matter of 3 months.
Now,
there must have been some other efficiency.
It was a bureaucratic knocking of heads together where they got the Army to take part, and then we ended up getting George Marshall and other great people who started in the CCC. But they got the Army to work with the Labor Department and the Interior Department, and then they ran the whole thing out of the White House, and they did not want to work together. They all told Roosevelt, this can't work. Francis Perkins told him. The Army people hated the idea. The labor unions fought it tooth and nail because they were only paid $1 a day. And Roosevelt had a strong will and a lot of determination and enough knowledge to make it work. And he would dismiss their objections. And the basic subtext was, you make it work or I'm going to kick you the hell out of here. So what I don't understand about Bush is why he didn't say to FBI Director Mueller, you fix those computers at the FBI in 4 months so we can connect the dots, or you're not going to be FBI director anymore. The idea of it taking more than 4 years to fix those computers is preposterous, and the same thing goes for a lot of other things in this administration. So a lot of it is just lighting a fire under people, knocking their heads together, making it clear that you can kiss his ass as much as you want, but if you don't perform, you're out of there.
Or with Katrina, why didn't he say when he first saw the people at the Dome, I want troops there tomorrow? And,
Well, did you see the videotape? Did you see the videotape of him sitting there? The guy who were told, in the teleconference on Katrina, the videotape was released. It was very interesting. The guy were told by his aides, he's always asking a lot of questions. He's the guy who's really in charge. He wasn't saying anything. He just was paralyzed at a point where he should have been grabbing the reins and being a good leader. And this is something, Mickey, that frankly, you and I have disagreed a lot about. The guy's a bad president, and eventually, I'm not talking ideologically here, I'm just talking about in terms of getting stuff done competently. You have to be a certain kind of effective manager and competent manager.
Coming around to that viewpoint,
Yeah.
the trouble with it early on was the Afghanistan war was very effective. Except for Tora Bora.
Well, now it's not. Now it's not working very well. Yeah, no, that was the Afghanistan war was, but and I actually was an admirer of Rumsfeld for a long time. But at a certain point, when the guy's not doing the job and when he makes a series of awful decisions, to keep him there, and then the other people who made awful decisions to give them the Presidential Medal of Freedom, you get the sense
that's a liberal canard. You give people Presidential Medals of Freedom as a gold watch when you're ushering them out the door.
That's not what happened.
That's what happened to George Tenet. Who cares if he gets a medal? The point was they got rid of him.
And way after he should have.
Well, but the problem.
And by the way, I'm not sure that he did. I'm not sure that he did get rid of him. By the way, but
he's not still there.
No, but I don't think he didn't leave it at the choice of the president. I don't think.
Oh, really? Well, here's another. That's a very good sort of anti-Bush contrast with FDR. Here's a similarity with FDR, which is FDR was very deceptive.
Yes.
No American president, even Bush, who is, I agree, often gives false rationales for things, could get away with what FDR did with the court packing plan, where he said he wanted to expand the court because it couldn't handle its workload.
Right.
Obviously, he wanted to expand the court because he wanted to change the results in cases. the Lend-Lease program, the getting us to help Britain on the eve of World War II, was fraught with deception and fake rationale.
Yes.
Yet it was to a good end. So why does the left go crazy when Bush says we're going for war in Iraq for one reason, and then they say, oh, that reason doesn't work, without assessing the underlying real reason?
I think that's a fair point. And I have not been, hugely critical of a lot of that, because a lot of presidents have been deceptive. That doesn't justify it, but I think your comparison with FDR on that is fair. What's different is on the warrantless wiretapping, where Bush claimed he had these inherent powers as commander-in-chief to go around Congress. And the court packing scheme, people think that was Bush, that was FDR acting like a dictator and just signing an executive order expanding the Supreme Court. It was a bill in Congress, which was defeated in Congress, and which his first top aide, Ray Moley, was the first witness testifying against it. So, he would do these things that were arrogant, wrong-headed, whatever, make mistakes, made many of them, but he wasn't, most of the time, he was not trying to pretend that he was a law unto himself, and he worked very, very closely with Congress, and there was a lot of opposition to a lot of what he did in Congress for most of his presidency.
You discovered a hot doc in this respect.
He what? Yeah.
You discovered a hot document that nobody else had discovered, where some aide wrote a line in his speech where he basically offered to promise to sort of seize dictatorial powers, and he didn't. He either crossed it out or didn't deliver it.
Right. He didn't deliver this version of the speech. It was to the American Legion, and he basically created a private army on his first day in office, but he didn't do it. He never gave the speech. You got to remember the climate then. Dictator was a positive word. Mussolini was really, really popular in the United States at this time, and Walter Lippmann, who was a pundit and columnist, later for Newsweek, at a time when those guys, unlike today, had real stature in American culture, when the MSM had some stature. And he went to Roosevelt and said, you may have to assume dictatorial powers, Franklin. Fortunately, he had so misread Roosevelt and called him a lightweight, and that's another comparison to Bush. So a lot of the pundits called Roosevelt a lightweight, that Roosevelt didn't listen to Lippmann, and he didn't listen to all the editorials that said things like, wanted a dictator, and he decided not to create this private army of retired veterans, not to go in an extra-constitutional direction, and it was a critical decision, and I argue that he saved not just capitalism in a few weeks, but also democracy.
No, I thought that was very interesting. We've only got a few minutes left. I wanted to make my basic pitch, which is, I grew up in the era of neoliberalism when Gary Hart famously declared the New Deal is dead. That was when they blew up the housing projects in St. Louis because they were a disaster. And this book is basically a description of how the New Deal was a wonderful thing and how it came into being. But there are some revealing things you say about Roosevelt that seem to me there's sort of a blazing arrow toward the worst of liberalism. You point out that in many ways he was a snob, or at least he started out a snob. He gave some speeches where he referred to people as hillbillies. He really liked well-bred women, not lower-class women. And he really did have a sense of noblesse oblige, which is in both the good and the bad sense. He was helping people who were inferior to him. And it seems to me there's a direct line from that sense, which you document was real, to the sense that liberalism is judged by compassion and how we feel for the least among us. And I just think, that's a terrible basis for politics, because it basically implies that people you're helping are unequal, they're lower down, and it also leads towards sort of give them cash solutions. It leads directly basically toward welfare. If you treat people as equals, then you want to give them work, not welfare.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Roosevelt hated the dole, and he said this over and over again, and that's why he created all these job programs. And you wrote a piece, I think, about, you supported some years ago, if I remember right, FDR-style jobs programs. He also...
he made the right decision, but it's been lost in the liberal rhetoric of the succeeding
I think a lot
years.
of things have been lost, and he wasn't wedded to any of these things. That's what a lot of liberals don't understand. He even wanted to cancel the CCC, and then Congress saved it in the mid-'30s. He didn't care about this alphabet soup of agencies. I mean, my daughter is studying for AP test last night, and she's lost in all these alphabet soup agencies she has to memorize. And I told her, I said, FDR didn't care about any of these. They were just means to an end to show forward progression against the Depression, and he would kill a lot of them when they weren't working. His most important speech, which was written by a journalist, nowadays you get fired for this, a guy named Ernest Lindley, was during the campaign when he called for bold, persistent experimentation. If one thing doesn't work, try another, but above all, try something. So I think FDR would have been bulldozing, dynamiting those housing projects when they weren't working much earlier than modern-day liberals. If it didn't work, he wasn't interested in it. He wasn't wedded to ideology. Now, did he believe in helping the downtrodden with a sense of noblesse oblige? Yes, and I would defend that. I think that having a government that sees itself as committed to the less fortunate is the moral approach for government.
See,
it can be patronizing, but that's all in the execution. And so you don't do it in a patronizing way, or if you do it in an ineffective way, you get rid of it. And that's the part of FDR's liberalism that a lot of latter-day liberals, not all, but some, ignored at their peril, which was to be pragmatic and flexible. And the big...
I thought what you were going to say is his noblesse oblige was tempered by getting polio and founding this clinic in Warm Springs,
yes,
where he tried to treat polio victims, and it becomes clear in your description of it, and it's sort of obviously true, that if you're treating polio victims, the most important thing is restoring their self-esteem and respect,
yes,
and dignity as people.
Exactly.
So it's not enough just to help them and treat them and give them food. You have to sort of build up their sense of pride and dignity, and that sort of tempers any... You can't be patronizing because they'll sense it, and that'll just make things worse.
Right, and he did that brilliantly with the whole country on a larger stage with a more widespread affliction. And so, yes, and he never called them hillbillies or anything like that after Warm Springs, after the 20s. He really did connect with ordinary people, even though he was a patrician, and he learned that at Warm Springs. And so, he wasn't an intellectual by any means. He made a lot of mistakes. He was wrong in the 100 Days in being against federal deposit insurance, for instance. He did that very reluctantly. But he was supple. And that's what I think is missing from Bush. I mean, he didn't, it's harsh to call him a bad president. I don't think he should be impeached. But he's not supple. And you really have to have that to be an effective leader.
I expected it to be a lot more supple than he's been, like, when he flipped and was for the Department of Homeland Security. I thought he'd be doing that throughout his term. Like, right now, why doesn't he endorse the Mitt Romney health insurance plan?
Great point. Or why doesn't he endorse a windfall profits tax on the oil companies? Now, even if you don't want to, beat up on them mindlessly, that's fine. But, as several people have pointed out, I mean, one of the reasons these oil prices have gone up so much is because of the war. Well, the war costs money. Somebody's going to pay for it. Right now, we're putting it on our credit card for our grandchildren to pay for. My argument, not my argument, a lot of people's argument, why shouldn't the oil companies be paying for some of the war that is causing their excessive profits now? So a windfall profits tax now is just common sense, but he's so kind of connected to this idea of sticking to principle. He's become so rigid. I argue it's because, as a recovering alcoholic, this is my argument in last week's Newsweek, which was sort of his polio, it made him very disciplined, which is good, and that took him a long way after age 40. But it also made him rigid because not everybody, but quite a number of people who've been through recovery, and as I've covered the recovery movement, they say that getting a routine that you stick to is very important because they feel like if you pull a thread on your routine and your views that you might then relapse, So I think a lot of that is that great discipline that Bush has. He's probably the most self-disciplined president we've had in a long time, much more than Roosevelt. It's hardened into rigidity, which is really hurting him now.
Yeah. Very good point. We're almost at half an hour, so thank you very much. Have you been reviewed yet?
There's a really good review that's coming out in the Sunday New York Times book review.
Really,
And
really good in both senses.
what do you mean?
It's brilliant and favorable.
Yes.
Well, good. It should be. This is a really good book. I really enjoyed reading it. And like I say, it's like all your Newsweek training paid off because you don't waste any of the reader's time. You come up with a telling quote. The paragraphs, the chapters are short. It tells you everything you need to know. So I really do recommend it. If you weren't a good friend of mine, I'd still recommend it.
Well, I'm really grateful to you for that, Mickey, because one of the things we've known each other for a long time, but I know that your allegiance is to the truth, and if you thought the book sucked, you would not say this, and I think anybody who knows you knows this, so it means a lot to me that you liked it.
And I went back and read, after reading your book, I went back and tried to read some of my book, and it was unreadable.
No, your book's very good. I recommend your book too.
Well, it's more academic, though. Your book is sort of has plot and characters and things happen, and people have, there's sex in it. It's a good read.
Well, thanks.
So good luck, and hope to see you at one of your book parties.
Okay. Thanks, Mickey.
Okay, see you, John. Thanks.